clear, raise your hand and say, what was all that about? And that's fine.
Where do you come from?
Okay, that's the challenge for you to discover by the end of the lecture. Now, what I want to do today is spend a little time talking about some new ideas in phonology. And what we're going to focus on is syllable structure. And what I want to do is to try and challenge a few traditional assumptions about how syllable structure works in English. So I hope some of these ideas will be new to you and give you a flavor of current progress in phonology. And there may even be a practical spin-off to it, and that's what I want to start with. And I want you to think about the first couple of days or weeks that you started to learn English. Now, for some of you, that might be too long ago to be able to remember, or maybe you were so young that you learned English. I mean, if you learned English when you were very, very young, you won't remember any of this, and you may not have had any problems with what I'm going to talk about. But if you learned English maybe later than the age of 12, you will have probably encountered consonants, clusters of consonants at the beginnings of words in English, and some of you will have found those a bit odd at the start. And the ones I'm going to focus on are given to you on the handout in number 1. Consonants consisting of an S followed by a cluster, by a consonant. So words like sport, sting, skin, split, string. Now, if your first language was, let's say, this is in 1B, if it was Italian or Dutch or Greek or Polish, you probably wouldn't have given those consonant clusters a moment's thought, and they would almost certainly not have caused you any trouble. On the other hand, I suspect for a lot of you here, they did cause you trouble. And what's interesting is, first of all, why they cause second language learners trouble, and secondly, why it is that different languages result in different types of approaches to the problem. Let me just give you 1B2 there. If you focus on 2 ways of dealing with these S plus consonant clusters. One way is to put a vowel in front of the S. So instead of saying split or sport, you say something like esport or esplit. Now, I see some nodding heads at this point. So some of you probably acknowledge that you did this at the beginning. Not that you do it now, right? You would never do that now. But maybe your students do this at the very beginning. The other way you can do it is to break up the cluster by putting a vowel between the S and the following consonant. So you say something like support instead of sport, okay? I see another set of heads nodding. This is what they did on day 1 of learning English, or perhaps what your students do when you start to teach them. Now, in fact, it's not random which way this goes. If your first language was, say, Spanish or Catalan or Portuguese or Welsh, you're likely to have taken the first of those options. That is, you would have put a vowel in front and talked about a sport, a split. On the other hand, if your first language was Japanese or Korean or Swahili or Zulu, I'm sure that handout is extremely interesting, but it's got nothing to do with this lecture. In fact, I was intending to take it away myself and read it afterwards. It looks so interesting. I mean, you're welcome to have it. All right, so it depends what your first language is, basically. And well, you can see pretty obviously what must be going on is that the syllable structure is different in all of these languages, or at least there are 3 different types of syllable structure. In languages like Italian, Dutch, Greek, Polish, it's very similar to English. On the other hand, in languages like Catalan, Spanish, Turkish, it's different in one way, and then in languages like Japanese, Korean, Swahili, Zulu, it's different in a different way. Okay, now, before we go on to ask why this is true, it's probably worth thinking about what a first language learner does. What does a child do when she's learning English? And in fact, you'll be interested, I hope you're interested to discover that first language learners have the same trouble as second language learners do. That is, those clusters of S plus consonant are acquired quite late by learners of English, baby learners of English. And they treat those clusters quite differently from ones beginning with pl, br, and you can see this in 1C. So they tend to drop the S. I've had normal English-speaking child in the first stages of language acquisition is likely to pronounce a word like spoon as poon, or sting is sting, and skin is kin. On the other hand, with consonant clusters like pl, pr, tr, cr, they drop the second consonant. So instead of saying play, they say pay. Instead of saying bread, they say bed. Okay, so first language learners also register dislike of these consonants. Okay, now, I said it's got something to do with syllable structure, so we need some terminology to talk about syllables. And in 2 here on the handout, you'll see traditional labels that are given for talking about what the insides of syllables look like. It's generally agreed that syllables break up into smaller components, smaller parts, known as constituents. And the terminology, I don't know if this is new to you, but the consonant at the beginning of a syllable is called the onset. You can see this in 2b. The nucleus of the syllable, that's where the vowel is. That's the kind of core of the syllable. And then to the right of that, if there is a consonant, that's called the coda. So if you get a word like guilty there in C, that's got 2 syllables, gil and t. And that first syllable consists of an onset g, a nucleus I, and a coda l. So that gil syllable forms a coda, a syllable onset followed by a nucleus followed by a coda. And we're going to use those terms in order to be able to talk about what happens. The term rhyme is sometimes used to talk about the vowel and the consonant following it as a single component. So a coda and a nucleus together will form a rhyme. So in guilty, ill forms a rhyme. Is that clear? It's just kind of background terminology before we get on to the interesting stuff. Now, let's think about onsets for the time being, and we'll push ahead to 3b here. If you think about English words and how many consonants you can have at the beginning of a word, some words can begin with 0 consonants, right? So words like I or am, for example, they have no consonant. That means they have no onset at the beginning, so it's a 0 onset. Or you can have 1 in a word like pie. You can see this in 3b. 3b2, there's that word pie, it's got a single consonant. And a word like pry, there are 2 consonants, and what we want to say there is that the onset of the syllable branches. That means it's complex. It's got 2 branches to it, and each of those branches is occupied by a separate consonant. So, so far we can see that there's at least 2 consonants maximum possible in English. Likewise, if you head on to 3d and you think about a rhyme in English, take a word like penny, which has got 2 syllables, pe and ni. In both cases, the branches, there are no branches, right? A penny is a very simple set of 2 syllables. The rhyme in those syllables does not branch. Whereas in guilty, as we saw before, the first syllable is more complex because the rhyme branches. So you can see that in 3d2 there. The ill part of guilty, that consists of a nucleus followed by a coda, and together those form a rhyme, and it's a branching rhyme, so it's a complex rhyme. Okay, is that clear so far, up to the bottom of page 2? How are we doing? Am I talking too fast, or too slow maybe? Too fast. Okay, I'll try to speak more slowly. What about the content of what I've mentioned here? Is that clear? Okay. All right, now let's think about the differences between different languages, because this is what we were talking about right at the start. Now, it turns out that languages differ according to whether or not they allow a syllabic constituent to branch. So if you look at the top of page 3 there, you will see, let's focus on the onset for the time being. And you look at languages like Japanese, Swahili, Malay, they permit non-branching syllable onsets. That means you can have 1 consonant, words beginning with 1 consonant, that's okay. But in those languages, you're not allowed to have branching structures. So you cannot have words that begin with 2 consonants in those languages. So Japanese doesn't have words that begin with br or bl, right? That's why that encapsulates that difference. Whereas if you look at English, Spanish, Greek, you can have words that begin with 2 consonants. And so we say that in English, you can have both non-branching words and branching words. Words with non-branching onsets, words with branching onsets. And this is a typical situation for syllable structure, that you find that all languages allow words with the non-branching option, but only a subset of languages also allow words with the branching option. There's some kind of an implication there, right? If you have a branching option, that means you must have the non-branching one. But it doesn't necessarily follow that if you have a non-branching option, that you also have a branching option. Now, in fact, you may not know this, but let me just tell you that the languages on the first line are in the majority amongst the world's languages. Most languages behave like Japanese, in fact. English and Spanish and Greek are in the minority in this respect. They allow more than one consonant in the onset. What about rhymes? Okay, rhymes, you remember that's the bit to do with whether or not a syllable has got a consonant at the end. Japanese, Zulu, Yoruba, they all say yes, you're allowed to have rhymes that don't branch. That means that you can have a syllable that ends in a vowel. But they say no to syllables that end in a consonant. So in those languages, you could never have a word like guilty, because there's an L at the end of that syllable, which involves a branching rhyme. So in those languages, all you will ever hear is consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel. Single consonant, vowel, single consonant, vowel, single consonant, vowel. That's actually the majority of the world's languages. On the other hand, in languages like English, Spanish, and Italian, you also get branching structures, as in the word guilty. Okay, now that was just a bit of cross-language comparison so that we can press on now and talk about the beginnings of words in English. And I'm now going to ask you, how many consonants can you have at the beginning of a syllable in English? Which is another way of saying, how many consonants can you get in the onset of a syllable in English? What's the maximum?
3.
Okay, 3 is what you find in the standard textbooks, right? And so give me examples of words that have got 3 consonants. Street, sprite, okay? So on the face of it, it looks like English allows a 3-way branch for the onset. And that is indeed the standard answer that you get. This is summarized in 4A on the handout. Now, I just want you to think about what assumption underlies that response. And it's this, it's in 4B. The set of possible onsets, syllable onsets, corresponds to the set of possible word initial clusters. So that's what you're assuming when you say that you can have up to 3 consonants in the beginning of a syllable in English, is that all you've got to do is to look at the beginning of a word to see what the beginning of a syllable looks like. Okay, that's an assumption that lies behind that claim. In fact, it's going to turn out that that assumption is almost certainly wrong. That the beginning of a word does not always coincide with the beginning of a syllable. And I'm going to sort of try and give you some of the evidence that shows that's the case, and that is what is going to challenge one of the traditional views of how syllables work in English. A lot of current research has come to the conclusion, and this is in 4C, that there is a maximum of a binary limit on the syllable onset, that you can never have more than 2 consonants in a syllable onset. Now, you might think, well, that's a very weird thing to say, given words like street, spring, etc. So what I want to do is now try and convince you that words like string, sprint, sprite do not begin with an onset, they begin with something else. And that's why some people have a problem with it when they learn English. Okay, now just look at 5 here. It's sort of spelling out what I've just been saying there. You know, 5B would be the traditional assumption that you can have a 3-way branch in the onset in English. But the claim that I'm going to make and try and defend is that that's a wrong analysis. The asterisk or the questions in front of that is meant to undermine your confidence in the notion that that's right. Okay, now what's the evidence? Okay, we're going to look at 2 different sorts of evidence. Some of the evidence is going to be phonetic, and some of it is going to be phonological. The phonetic evidence is going to be to do with the physics of speech. And the phonological evidence is going to do with how sounds pattern together in a system like English. So let's begin with the phonetic evidence. Okay, and the notion we're going to start with is sonority. It's a technical concept which I'd like to try and explain right away. Now, this is probably going to sound really bad on the microphone, I'm sorry. Okay, what do we mean about by sonority in language, in sound systems? Okay, let me start with a technical definition. let me ask you something. If you, what's the first sound that would come to your lips if you were falling off a cliff? Ah, all right. That seems to be a favorite one. Would anyone prefer some other sound on your way down? If you kind of run through the IPA chart or the number of phonemes in your language, you think, I could try t. Would you be interested in using t on the way down? It doesn't have quite the same impact, right? Maybe s. Not really very good. Maybe f, right? Well, okay, you might do that, but that's for other reasons. But, I mean, why did you all pick on a? I mean, I know this is not a random result, by the way. We've done empirical work on this, and of course, one way of doing empirical work is to hang around cliffs and wait for people to jump off, and then you kind of record whatever sounds. That's real field work, that you can do. But there's a painless way of doing it, in fact, and that's to read comics in different languages. And of course, in comics, people are falling off cliffs all the time, and you see speech bubbles coming out of their mouths as they descend the side of the cliff, and I can confirm that it's always a. All right. So now, why is it a? Why is it not something else?
It's the most immediate sound because it's just opening one's mouth.
Right. It's the most immediate sound because you open your mouth. Well, on the other hand, you could say, well, the time it takes you to open your mouth could be the time it takes you to. So that might not be a great reason, right?
It's natural sound.
Pardon?
Natural sound.
Okay. What do you mean by natural?
That's sound children learn to do when.
That's actually true, but why do children learn that first? This is pushing the question back all the time. What were you saying here?
Easy.
Well, easy. See, I don't like that. That explanation is suspect because you have to lower your jaw, so you have to make an effort to do that. It's the most well-heard sound. It's got to do with hearing, not to do with pronunciation. It's the loudest speech sound known to man and woman. Right? It is the loudest possible speech sound that you can pronounce. On the other hand, t, or think about t. What's going on during? A plosive is made up of an approach phase, a hold phase, and a release phase. Okay, during the hold phase of t, how much noise is coming out of the mouth? Right, 0. Okay. If I say a, ta, what you hear in the middle of that sequence of vowel, consonant, vowel, somebody's doing the vacuuming. You hear nothing. It's complete silence. And what we've actually put our finger on here is what really sonority is about in speech. And what I've done in 6b there is to show what's called the sonority hierarchy. And it's arranging sounds from the quietest to the loudest, going from left to right. It's like a volume control. The loudest sounds are mid and low vowels like a and e and o. And the quietest sounds are plosives. And in between, sounds are arranged in intermediate steps. So for example, fricatives are less loud than nasals, which are less loud than liquids, which are less loud than glides and high vowels. So, and we sometimes refer to this as the sonority hierarchy. Now, why am I telling you all this? I mean, the reason is that sonority plays an extremely important role in the organization of sounds into syllables. And the principle that's involved here is given to you in 6c. A nice syllable, a good syllable, a cool syllable is one that consists of a sonority peak, that is a peak of loudness, which will correspond to the nucleus of the syllable. And it's going to be flanked possibly on either side or on both sides in sounds which decrease in sonority. So if you think about a nice syllable like ta, for example, it begins with 0 sonority and builds up to very high sonority. Now, let me just give you some words here and you can work out how this profile works. I mean, look at 6D, the first line there in words like pie and pity. Right? Now in pie, you start with low sonority, you build up to a sonority peak, and then you tail off again for the high vowel. So that's pie. That looks like one syllable, one sonority peak. So it looks like a nice guide to the number of syllables in a word is by simply listening to the number of peaks of sonority. By peak, we mean the bit of the syllable that has the highest degree of sonority. In a word like pity or pity, I have to make an effort to say the T there. Right? In a word like pity, what have we got there? Well, we got two sonority peaks in the form of the vowels, and we've got two sonority troughs. That trough is the lowest point. I think I've given you the word there, have I? I guess I haven't. Trough is just a region of low something. In this case, is low sonority. People use this on weather charts, right, when they talk about pressure differences. There are pressure troughs and pressure peaks. Okay, here we're talking about sonority. So in pi, there's one peak, and in pity, there are two peaks. And you'd be pretty confident now in saying, okay, the number of syllables in a word is reflected in the number of peaks. Okay, that looks like a nice phonetic definition of a syllable. That's a physical definition. Unfortunately, it starts to get a bit trickier when you think about words like spy. If you look at a word like spy there on the lower line of D, how many peaks has it got? Well, actually, there's a peak for the S that's got higher sonority than the following P. So you go high sonority, nothing, then you go back up for the following vowel, and then you tail off again. So that there are in fact two sonority peaks in this word. But according to the traditional textbooks, there's only one syllable. Okay? So now it looks like the traditional definition of a syllable doesn't have a physical definition. It's some kind of more abstract notion. So either it's wrong or it's more abstract. Okay, you can also see this at the right edge of a word. If you take a word like tax, okay, how many syllable peaks there? How many sonority peaks? There's one for a, and then you go down again for the k, and then back up for the s. So you have two peaks there, giving you tax. Again, the traditional account of English syllable structure would say there's one syllable, even though physically there are two peaks. So there's the first piece of evidence we've looked at. It's phonetic evidence, it's physical evidence, it's got to do with sonority, and it indicates that the S in an S plus consonant cluster doesn't behave like it's in the same syllable as whatever happens next. It's kind of off on its own little peak. So the phonetic evidence indicates that that S plus consonant is not part of the same syllable. Are there questions about sonority or about the conclusions that we're drawing on the basis of the sonority facts? Okay. I think this would be a good time to take a 2-minute break so that you can talk to your neighbour and just to check that you've understood what we've been doing so far. And if you immediately agree that you understand everything, then you can talk about something more interesting. So 2 minutes. But that's enough. What I want you to do now is to turn to page 5 and think about the possible combinations of consonants that you can get at the beginning of a word in English. And you can see this in 7a. So we're focusing on words that begin with two consonants. And C1 is arranged down the way, and C2 is arranged across the way. And you can read this like a football fixture program for the season. All right. So does C1 play C2? Okay, in week 1 of the season, P plays L and gets a result. Okay, if you see a plus there, that means that there are words that begin with those clusters. So that top left-hand corner with a plus is a pl, and so a word like play, there are plenty of words like that in English. So that's a good consonant cluster in English. Likewise, pr is good, as in pray, pram, but nothing else is going to work in English. You can't have pw, can't have t, can't have pk, can't have pn. Right? So in fact, if you think about it, P got a really bad season there, right? P only won two games and lost the rest. That's kind of relegation form. T's not much better, but notice that T wins different games. T gets a tr, like in train, gets a w, as in 12, but doesn't get any of the others either. K does a little bit better. K has a good start to the season and wins the first 3 games in a row, getting cl, cr, and qua, right? So clever, creative, and quick. Okay, and then nothing after that. B behaves exactly like P. Notice, gets a couple of results against L and R, bring and light, but loses everything else. G behaves like K. So you got glee, glean, green, and was not so common, but there are words like Gwen and Gwendolyn, Gwyneth. They're all Welsh words, by the way, which is interesting. Okay, F, that gets fling and fry, but nothing else. And Th gets through and thwart and thwait, but nothing else. So in fact, the possibilities of combining, the theoretical possibilities are much higher than what you actually get. So notice there are very heavy constraints on what can be in the second position of a 2-consonant cluster at the beginning of a word in English. Now compare that with S, and you see that S actually has a really good season, and basically wins everything except one game, and therefore would be champion. Right? So S can have sling, can have swing, spite, sting, skin, smile, snide. So it behaves completely differently from all the other consonants in the 2-consonant clusters. Now that should worry you. If you're a phonologist, you want to know why you get these imbalances. What is the explanation for this complete imbalance? Now think about the sonority profile. Think about all of those clusters in the first part of the table. What can you say about the sonority of all of those in the first part?
Thank you.
Okay. What about the sonority? It's consistent. And what is it?
Higher than.
Yeah, which one's higher? The second one is higher than the first. The second consonant is always higher than the first in the first part of the table, which means that you have a rising sonority slope. You start off with low sonority and you build up, which means whatever comes next, the vowel is even higher in sonority. That looks like a great syllable, starting low, gradually building up. What about the ones with S? Some of them rise, like slut, but a lot of them fall. You get S followed by T, for example, is like in sting. You start with high sonority, then you go down again, and then you come back up again. So the disparity between the first part of the table and the second part of the table has got something to do with the sonority physics that we talked about earlier. Now, the conclusion in 7D is that from the viewpoint of sonority and the distributions that we've just seen, that is the combinability of the consonants we've just seen, S and a consonant in an S consonant cluster don't belong to the same syllable. They behave as though they just didn't talk to each other. Now, I want to give you another piece of phonological evidence, and this is going to be an 8 on the handout. And in order to do this, we really need to put ourselves in the shoes of somebody who speaks with a pronunciation of the sort that you find in Daniel Jones' Pronouncing Dictionary. All right. Now, there are actually fewer and fewer of these people alive each year, but for the purposes of this, I mean, basically, it's a very old-fashioned South of England type pronunciation. It might be called hyper RP. It's kind of super RP. And I don't know whether some of you teach this. I'd be curious to know whether this is what you actually teach as a model. But for the purposes of demonstrating it, I'm going to have to take on the guise of Daniel Jones in order to pronounce these correctly. All right? Now, what I want you to do is to focus on words in English that begin with a consonant followed by a sequence of U, that is Y followed by U. So it's going to be words like beauty, cute, words like that, where you begin with a consonant and then the next bit is U, Y followed by O. Now, if you look at 8A1 there in row 1, there's words like cute, pewter, beauty, music, tune. I mean, I haven't started to sound like Daniel Jones yet. You may have noticed. Tune. Well, actually, I've got to do it now because I don't say these ones. So tune, due, new, and suit. Okay. Now, in all of those pronunciations, you hear a glide y, that approximate, that palatal approximate y, in between the consonant and the vowel. So what we're actually going to focus on is whether or not you can have this here. And in all of these words, you obviously can. So apparently when you have one consonant to the left of it, you're okay. You know, if that's the left edge of the word, the beginning of the word, then if there's only one consonant there, you can have a y there. Now, I want to focus on L for a second, because that's going to turn up a bit later in this data set. In 8A2 there, words like, and here I do have to put this one on, right? Lule, lude, lucid, and revolution, right? I mean, those are dictionary pronunciations where you hear a y following an L. How many people have a y in those words, by the way?
Two of them.
Two of them, okay. I mean, some, like in, which one?
The first two. Liu,
First,
Lude.
you and lude. Okay, so at least some people still have some of these words with you. So I guess it might get taught that way as a model in second language teaching. Okay, now think about the words in 8A3. Words like blue, clue, glue, and plumage. Now what do we got there? We have two consonants followed by L, but in none of these words do you hear a y. Okay, there's an U coming next, but you never hear a y in there. So blue, clue, glue, and plumage. Okay, now are there any words in this dialect, or indeed in English, which can begin with bl or cl followed by u? So what they would sound like would be like blue or glue or lucid, beauty. Okay, that's what it would sound like. And you should be smiling because there are no words like that. Right? There are simply no words in English that can begin with two consonants followed by L, followed by Y, followed by O. I'll put a star there to show that that's not possible. Now the question is, why is that? You know, why is it possible to have a Y before one consonant, but not following one consonant, but not following two consonants? What's the explanation? Well, we would have an explanation if we said there are a maximum of two consonants in the onset in English. If you said there's a binary limit on the onset in English, you would have an explanation. How would the explanation work? Well, if you turn to the top of the page, you'll see top of page 6. On C there, if you take a word like few, there's no problem there for the y to appear because there will be two positions in the onset, there will be two consonant slots in the onset, and the y can fill the second of those. So the palatal glide or the palatal approximant can appear as the second member of a branching onset if there are two positions there. However, and this is shown in D, the y cannot appear after two consonants for the reason that the onset's already full. If there's a limit of two, a binary limit on the onset in English, we would explain why you never get words like blue and glue, because the onset's already full. It's already saturated by two consonants. In this example, the B and the L take up two positions in the onset, and if there's a binary limit, there's no more room for the y there. So that would explain why there are no words like this in English. Okay? But at the back of your mind, you're thinking, yeah, but what about the S plus consonant? Okay, well, let's jump back okay, no, let's not jump back. Let's stay on page 6. If that's going to be true for, there are no words like blue in English. Now, if the traditional approach to English syllable structure were correct, what would you predict about words beginning with S plus, say, T, for example, or S plus? Well, you would assume that they were in the onset. That's the traditional way of doing it, right? So you would then predict that there should be no words in English that have this sequence. But do you see how you would make that prediction? If you say there are no words like this because the onset's already full, if you assume that S plus consonant is in the onset, you will also make the prediction that there should be no words that begin this way. Now, is that correct? Is this, I should put a question mark here. Is it correct to say that there are no words in English that begin with these sequences? It's not correct, in fact, right? So the prediction is wrong. There are, in fact, words that begin with ST and Y and S. Sorry, I've used a Y there, but it should be a J, right? So you know what I mean, I hope. It's the palatal line I'm talking about. Some people write it with a Y and some people write it with a J. Okay, if you could, now you can go back to page 5 and to 8A5. And there are plenty of words like stew, skew, spew. That's a perfectly vanilla cluster in English. Okay, from the traditional point of view, that's a big problem. How do you, if the S plus consonant really is like an ordinary onset, why is it behaving differently from the other onsets? The onsets like bl and br, they ban the appearance of a y following them. But S plus consonant doesn't ban it. How would we be able to explain that? Well, we cannot explain it by staying with the traditional assumption. We have to break with that assumption and press ahead with a new assumption, namely the one that if there's a maximum of 2 in the onset, we'll get an explanation by saying that S is not in the onset. And it would look like on page 6 again, under E. Let me just read out what I've said in E there. If S plus consonant were a true 2-consonant onset, we'd expect the y to be prevented from occurring after it, just as in words like blue. So how come the y can appear in that position? Well, we have the beginnings of an explanation if we assume that S in an S plus consonant cluster is not part of the onset. And you can see this in the pictures in E there. A word like spy, you would say that the P's in the onset, but the S is not in the onset. It's like, it's kind of pushed out at the left edge of the word. And in a word like skew, there'd be no problem if the k and the y are in the onset and there's a binary limit on the onset. The S can appear there because it's not in the onset. So you can now see why the y would appear in a word like skew, because it's the second part of a binary onset, whereas the S out somewhere else. So that's the conclusion we're kind of pushed to, really, that if we really want to take the sonority facts seriously, then we've got to say that S is actually not part of the onset. It's actually pushed out to the left edge of the word, but it doesn't begin in the onset. Are there questions about what we've set up to here? Okay, one question I would ask right away is, if the S is not in the onset in words like spew, skew, strew, where the hell is it? If it's got to belong to syllable structure and it doesn't belong to the onset, where does it belong? Well, in fact, there's a very old idea in phonology. This predates Western phonetics by many, many centuries. That the syllable structure of those words looks like in 9. This is in 9A, for example. One answer is that the S occupies the rhyme that's the coda of a syllable that has a silent or an empty nucleus. That is, words like spy, string, begin with a silent nucleus. That is a nucleus you don't hear. And that S is at the end of that syllable. Just like it would be in the middle of a word like pasta. Right? It's like saying the word begins with a rhyme, in fact. It begins with a vowel you don't hear, and then the S is at the end of that syllable. And then you start the next syllable. That's a very old tradition, in fact. It's embodied in syllable-based writing systems, which predate alphabetic writing by many centuries. Those of you who've never seen a syllable-based writing system, it's basically where a single symbol stands for a whole syllable rather than a single letter. And many of those systems build this idea into them. Now then the question would be, if that's a silent nucleus, if if there's a silent vowel at the beginning of those words, wouldn't it be nice if there were some occasions when you might hear that vowel? That would give us some evidence that there might be something there actually, beyond the evidence that we've looked at so far. Well, one way of thinking about this is to say that languages have a choice as to whether or not they're allowed to leave that nucleus silent. And some languages do allow it to be silent, and some languages forbid it to be silent. So I've kind of given you a lineup of different languages there in 9b. Languages that are allowed to begin with a silent nucleus include English, Italian, German, Greek, Polish, French. On the other hand, there are some languages that simply forbid you to start words with a silent nucleus. Spanish, Welsh, Turkish, Japanese, Catalan would all fall into that category. Now then the question is, well, what typically happens, this is on page 7 of the handout, what typically happens when speakers of a language of the no type, that is, if you are a speaker of a language that forbids silent nuclei at the beginnings of words, what do you do when you're learning English, or when you're learning Italian, or some language that does permit you to have silent nuclei? When you start to learn a language of that type, what do you do with words like spring, string, and string? Well, we know that there are two choices, which we saw right at the beginning of this lecture, and I'm going to come back to those choices. Let's start with the Spanish style one, the one that makes you say a stop, a sport. What have you actually done there? What is that vowel? Well, it is the sound of that nucleus. It is simply the phonetic, it's the physical interpretation of the nucleus that starts that word. So you are forced to pronounce that nucleus because of the syllable structure of the language bans silence at the beginnings of words. So you'll get a stop. And now this is only going to be possible in languages that have branching rhymes. So this is where the rhymes come in, right? Because if we're saying that a pronunciation like a sport, let's do this in phonetic script since we're all very expert users of phonetic script. If you pronounce something like a sport for sport, think of the syllable structure, right? That is going to be a nucleus, that's going to be a coda, there's a rhyme, there's an onset, there's a nucleus, etc., etc. So there's a syllable there, and there's a syllable there. So you have a closed syllable, you have a branching rhyme at the beginning there. That's how a Spanish or a Catalan or a Turkish speaker does these kinds of things when they're first coping with the English situation. Now you can only do that if you're allowed to have branching rhymes. Now how do you know whether or not you're allowed branching rhymes? Well, all you've got to do is to look in the middles of words and see if you can have clusters of S plus consonant there. And is that possible in Spanish? Is it? I'm going to ask you this because I guess there are Spanish speakers here. Is it possible in Spanish to have an S plus consonant cluster in the middle of a word with a vowel to the left and a vowel to the right? How many Spanish speakers are there in the room? So, no excuses here. Is it possible to have a word in Spanish that has a vowel followed by an S followed by a consonant in the middle of a word? Yes. Give me an example. Thank you for that simple example, which I'll not try to pronounce. But yes, that's an example. There is actually one on the handout. So siesta or hasta. So the S in there is in a coda, right? It's in a branching rhyme. So Spanish has branching rhymes. So it can do this at the beginning of a word. Now we come back to the other way of trying to cope with these clusters. Why does a Japanese speaker say stop rather than stop or stop? All right. Remember, you must, in order to have this solution, you must have words that have branching rhymes in the middle of the word. You must be able to have sequences of S plus consonant in the middle of a word in your language. Now, is that true of Japanese? Are there words like asta or pasta in Japanese? I suspect there are some Japanese speakers in the audience. Okay, let me tell you, it's no. There are no words like pasta in Japanese. What you have to have in Japanese is something like is pasuta, or that kind of thing, right? So when you borrow the word pasta, I guess you borrowed that word, right? What does it sound like? Pasta. If you write it down in syllable, if you write it down in terms of syllables, it's pasuta, right? Now, so that actually tells you something about Japanese. Japanese does not have branching rhymes. Japanese, it's impossible to do this in Japanese because Japanese hasn't got this here. So there's only one other alternative. You don't like to have silence at the start of the word, and you don't like to have branching rhymes. What's the only thing you can do? You have to put a vowel between the S and the following consonant. And this is what you got in C2 there. So sutop occurs in languages without branching rhymes, which will be shown by the fact that they lack internal S plus consonant clusters. And here the S of the target or the new word is accommodated into the onset of an initial new syllable. Basically what you have to do is to create a new CV syllable at the left edge of the word that you're learning, and you put a vowel in so that you actually hear it. So there's the explanation for, okay, there are two explanations we've come up with here. One is, why do certain languages not like S plus consonant clusters? You know, why do, and in fact, why do first language learners think that S plus consonant is a real Mickey Mouse cluster and that something needs to be done about it, right? Well, the explanation is that not all languages permit you to start words with silence, with a silent nucleus. Japanese doesn't allow that, Spanish doesn't allow that, Catalan doesn't allow that, Korean doesn't allow that. So those languages are similar in that respect. They don't allow you to start with a silent nucleus. Then there's a second point. Why do you get differences between Spanish and Japanese? Well, that difference resides in another part of syllable structure. It's to do with whether or not you're allowed branching rhymes. Spanish and Catalan are allowed branching rhymes, but Japanese is not, and Korean is not. So the result is that when you're trying to cope with this cluster and you don't have branching rhymes, you have to create a new syllable. On the other hand, when you do have branching rhymes, you can simply pronounce the vowel that is latently at the beginning of that syllable. Okay, now I'm going to stop early here because I would like us to have time to raise questions, but I think this would be a good point for me to stop. So thank you for your attention.